Welcome back to From Pain to Gain. Jason is here with me again, my BFF, FFF,
Hello,
times
welcome.
infinity.
Thank you. Good to be
What's
here.
How you doing, man?
Doing well, doing well. Looking
You
forward
got
to the
some
conversation.
facial growth action going.
Yes, it's getting gnarly. Time to either go into the forest or cut it.
This is what shows a successful entrepreneur right here, freelancer, that you could grow it like a forest land and everything is just going to keep going fine.
At least for now, we'll see.
Yeah. Dude, you've had that thing for years going up and down. But anyways, today we're talking about the commonality between evil groups and loving families. Evil groups, of course, think of the worst of it, KKK, Crips, Bloods, all the gangs you could think of, Nazis, neo-Nazis, all of the worst groups you could think of. And what's the commonality between them and loving families? There's going to be a lot of stuff we could connect here. That's going to be kind of weird, but it'll, I think, help us to see how we can relate to people a lot more than we think we can. So let's jump right in. I'm going to do it starting with a Tupac lyric. And he says, I hung around with the thugs, and even though they sold drugs, they showed a young brother love. And it just shows, like, even in the midst of him growing up in crime, I'm sure getting shot at a lot, and him at some point probably even selling drugs, I don't know his full history, he was able to get other brothers to show love to him. And to jump right into the CAGE acronym, in case you forgot, and how we're going to draw this topic through it, it's complacency, atrophy, guilt, and escape. So to start off with complacency, I wanted to draw a thread through this needle of how I could relate to it, a personal story. And it's so easy to get into a group of family, partnership, whatever, what have you, into the concept of the hand that feeds, right? And being susceptible to the hand that feeds. And I had this perception that this one person in my life, in a particular business venture out of many that I've had, that this person largely makes my job easy. They do most of the work, and I just kind of sit and count the checks type thing. But what over time happened was the unprofessional behavior kept mounting up. And I had this kind of balance of, like, should I address this or do I want to keep, just making money? I had this perception that I can't just replace that person easily, which down the line did end up happening. But essentially, I feared in that point of view, this is the hand that feeds, so I can't have it taken away from me, even though I had all the resources to do that. Jason, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so two things come to mind. First is that I immediately think of, in baseball or basketball or football or whatever sport you want to put it, there's often this conversation crops up about this really talented player that is a horrible person, has horrible character. And so the team tolerates the behavior and attitude of this person because they score enough points or enough touchdowns to sort of justify keeping them around, even though it's can be toxic for the team in different ways. And we obviously don't know all the details of those stories to understand them fully, but assuming that that's at least got a glimpse of truth on it, that's essentially very similar to what you're describing, right? So why get rid of this player? We would start losing versus winning. And so there kind of is two questions there, which is what is it? Does it matter how we win? And does it also matter to the people that are involved and how they're treated and the what they're subject to as part of that experience?
Yeah, the emotional cost, spiritual cost, XYZ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the costs. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just remembering a story. One of many stories for me is I used to have a marketing agency, And we had a particular client that we were been working with for years, and most of our interactions were fairly positive. But there was one part of the business that we were sort of, because of the work we were doing, it was now pressing in on a particular department, and that particular department was led by a particular leader, and that particular leader was a very toxic leader, and one that people did not like to interact with, did not like to work with, and had a lot of conflict surrounding this person. And so at the time, it sort of gotten to a point in my own journey where what I had to sort of reconcile the reality of like, okay, do I do what's right, regardless of what it might cost me to do that? Or do I sort of succumb to the pressures and the issues by just not shaking, not rocking the boat, not intentionally stepping on the eggshells. So in this particular case with this customer, we did push in on it, and we were able to make some progress and surface some conflict and work through some of that. At the root issue, we were not necessarily in a position of authority to truly make a difference. And we were also pushing on things that were rocking the boat for the company as a whole. And so it's possible, that client ended up deciding to go a different direction within a year or so of that process. And so you could say that maybe that did cost us. Our company was going this direction and their company was going another direction in terms of wanting to address that particular issue. And so it's kind of this interesting dynamic that, when that client is your biggest client, when they are paying you the most, like you experienced in your situation, we have to make that decision of, is it worth the money, right? And I think in the long run, we'll find that if we're doing it for that reason, one, will allow it to actually get worse and worse and worse, and two, there will be a personal cost in our character, in our mental health. And so those are things that are important to keep in mind, but it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, and the reality of it is that most people, when they're facing that type of challenge, we just buckle under the pressure and fold to whatever the pressure is, and it's takes a lot of courage to go against that.
Yeah, I saw Enron documentary on Amazon Prime a couple months ago, and it turns out that a very similar situation. This gentleman, the CEO, lost one of his big players and heard about this other guy that was on the come up and has a new way of looking at stocks, even though now we know it was not legitimate.
Yeah.
And it hurt a lot of people. I didn't realize how down to the actual weeds it got of hurt, because it turns out they were actually controlling California power lines to make it seem like power outages were happening. Mm-hmm. And they would literally just exorbitantly push their bills up to cover their stocks going up. And some really just atrocious things happened in that company. But essentially that CEO decided, oh, I could either let this company tumble or kind of sell my soul, as they call it, and get this guy in here, even though he maybe didn't have that perception going in. He maybe just thought, oh, this guy's an innovative leader that could make it happen. But it really ties us both into a similar scenario of, would we have allowed that to happen, and to what? Yeah. Are we that different from somebody that went down astray,
Yeah, and our if we believe that we're not susceptible to that, then we're actually creating a door to make us more likely to be susceptible to it. So I remember Chuck Colson, he's no longer alive, but he worked with Nixon in the Nixon administration. And he talks about how, he thought he was a good person and doing the right things, and he was not going to be corrupted. And here he was just caught up in the whole Nixon scandal. and just one step at a time, stepping into that corruption, and then being engulfed in it fully and not even seeing what had happened to him until after the fact when he reflected on it during his time in jail. So
Yeah, and I'm sure that same thing could apply to the Nazis, right? Like they just were encapsulated in his powerful speaking, his powerful authority as a leader, and didn't really even care to look at his background, his history, his
character,
motivations.
and he said a lot of things. If you read quotes from him, I mean, they sound like, wow, that's really compelling. um and then you see it's from him, and then you're like, oh. And so you can see when you do that, like if you read a quote and you don't know it's from him, and then you kind of go through that exercise, it makes it clear like how susceptible we could be. In fact, I have another book. It's called A World After Liberalism and Philosophers of the Radical Right.
Why are you
And there's
soliciting books on my?
and so I read this, and there's it has these far extremist ideologies. And when you read, when I went to get the book, I thought, oh, okay, these would be interesting to read. But what I found was that they're, in many ways, they can be very compelling. And
Mhm.
so I think we underestimate the depth of some of these ideologies that are out there, and how persuasive they can be, especially to someone who is grieving, someone who is um, bitter, someone who is angry. They're fill in the emotion, and if there's enough of it, there's some ideology out there that probably appeals to you.
Yeah, and we see that pretty recently, of course, in the Trump administration, but I'm sure there's lots of, on the other side, Democratic leaders that could have also been compelling and also brought people in to things and consequences that they were not aware of.
Yeah, and I was reading. I'll read a quote from you here. This is from Robert Keegan in a book called In Over Our Heads, and I'll just read a part of it. But he's talking about conflict. And he says, consider that the protracted conflict is a signal that you and your opponent have probably become identified with the poles of that conflict. And so what he means is, like, if there's a conflict and both sides gets kind of pushed to the outer poles, and then they're at each other, right? They're going at each other. And so to your point, and what tends to happen, and what I see and what I've been sucked into, and I think just reading this reminded me how I can be sucked into it, is if I'm getting pushed to a pole, like if I feel that, if I see myself doing that, then that one, it's just an awareness of that, but two, it's to recognize that extremism is an escalating thing. And so you have two sides that they get pushed to the poles, and then they escalate, and that just keeps ratcheting up, and it doesn't just stop because it goes up and up and up, and eventually, usually what tends to happen is it escalates into something dramatic enough that it gets one or both sides to go, what are we doing here? And but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes that event happens and it comes and goes, and the escalation continues. And so it's not an easy thing to reconcile, but we have an opportunity to be people that break the cycle of violence, that choose to step outside of that cycle, to not be polarized, and to be bridge builders instead. But to be a bridge builder is to be the object of wrath from both sides of the conflict.
Yeah, and then to speak to the ratcheting up, although I could argue that it's more of a downward spiral, a ratcheting downward spiral.
Yeah, you could say that might be a better way to say it. Is just look at Genesis. It's the spiraling of humanity over and over and over again into the ground.
But to speak to that, Grant Cardone has a great quote. He says, if you want to be president, you just have to get half the country to hate you. And it is a truthful, but also very saddening statement.
Yeah.
That outrage sparks kind of publicity, advertising.
Oh,
votes.
Yeah. I mean, look at how much, see, the media, as much as the media hates Donald Trump, they are also highly responsible for his election, because they give him tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars worth of free airtime. when he was in the primaries, being in his first terms. So he got all this free because of how much they hated him. He got all of this free media. So that's what came to mind when he said that.
Yeah. So we talked about more of the evil groups. What about where we don't see it necessarily immediately in loving families? How do they relate to the commonality, of evil groups?
So what I would say is, I think there's two sides of it. When you look at these groups, these extremist groups, you look at a family, I think there's two similarities, principally, possibly more, I guess. But the first would be, one, how they're interrelating to each other in a way that creates a sense of acceptance or love.
Security.
So security, there's some positive, right? Some positive benefit. And then there's the negative, which would be the self-interest and the pride and selfishness. And so the health of one or the other is going to be determined by how much of the good is manifesting in that group, and how much of the negative and the self-interest is manifesting. So it's sort of a scale, if you will, and eventually that scale is going to tip one way or the other. So I think in that way they relate at the same level. So what happens in a family is, ideally you have a healthy family that is loving and is not pursuing self-interest at the cost of the other family members, but is only pursuing things that, if pursued, make the family better, right? And so I'll give you just like a practical example. Like I'm doing in my freelancing work. I have my paid work that I do in consulting and whatnot, and I have other things that I want to pursue. I've got my books and my podcasts and things like that, but those don't necessarily generate income for me. So if I would have wanted to be, but I really enjoy doing them and I get a lot of meaning out of it. If I really wanted to pursue my self-interest, I would stop doing all my paid work and just pursue that stuff that I want to do relentlessly, right? And so, but I have a wife and I have 5 kids. And so by doing that, I'm actually would neglect the responsibilities I have to provide for my family. And so I'm pursuing my self-interest at their cost. And maybe in a short period of time, it may not be a big deal, but over time that would create a lot of problems in our life, in our relationships, and conflict and brokenness, and it would kind of spiral. So instead, what I have to do is I have to take care of my responsibilities and my duty, and then I can pursue those things that I love, a little bit at a time, and just take a slower path. And so it's not necessarily to say I can't pursue that thing. It's just what's its proper place. And so for us to understand its proper place, we have to be the type of person that can understand where its proper place is. And in order to be that type of person, we have to be developed into that type of person. So that would be maybe an example at a family level. But at a family level, you could also have the toxic spiral into a completely dysfunctional family, and that can happen at a young age, or it could happen. The family could be doing fairly well, and then all of a sudden, it seems like something comes out of nowhere and just demolishes the family. Maybe a person in the family dies or whatnot, and that can create a spiral. Yeah. So those positive and negative dynamics of both a family and some of these groups that we look at, like gangs and extremist groups, they can share a lot in common.
And depending, I guess, well, it might not be even age specific, but if the trauma of that person, like for example, dying or going into an addiction or just abandonment, right? If it's early on in a child's life, it could be much more susceptibility for that child to grow up to, like, say, oh, this mentor is awesome to me, and I'll make excuses because they treat me good, but they also happen to be the leader of the Bloods, or neo-Nazi or whatever. But they have helped me to feel love in a way I haven't felt before.
Yeah, and I think it could be a variety of things. I remember when I first moved to Atlanta, I had this political news website, and I had this guy reach out to me, and he was he liked what I was doing, and so we ended up kind of connecting. He was in California, I was in Georgia, And he ended up getting real involved. And, you know, I had that same kind of justification. Like, yeah, there's a lot of aspects of this person that I think are there's a clash of what he's seeking, his self-interest and the values that I have. But I thought to myself, you know what, I can handle it. You know, I can play with fire and not get burned, right?
You had
And
another
part of
bromance, Jason?
I did, yes. And it was a toxic mentor. And but what happened was, you know, I got pulled in. I wasn't able to. And part of it was I had just moved across the country. I was on my own, and I was trying to figure out how to run my business, how to live life. And I didn't really know what I was doing. And here's a person that I thought, oh, this person knows what he's doing. He's very confident. He kind of says what he thinks, and he goes for what he wants. And, you know, this is someone that that could help me, you know. And yeah, there's a lot of red flags, but I can navigate the landmines, you know, and just I won't step on those. I'll get to the treasure chest on the other side of the land field and the landmine field, and get my treasure,
Follow the
and then we'll all be
golden
happy.
brick road.
But then after stepping on landmine after landmine and realizing that there's no escape, I realized it was out of my league. I was in over my head. And so it's not an easy thing to get out of once you're caught up in it. So
Yeah. It's interesting for me, for people that are more strangers, I have throughout most of my life trusted more and gave more grace to close people closest to me, and I think that's a subject of my upbringing. But
yeah.
it's also something maybe to be mindful of when trying to discern if you're falling into um, that sort of bromance also, which I'm deeply hurt that you just confessed that to me, Jason.
Yeah.
I
Well,
thought I was the only one.
no, I'm afraid not, sir. So I think it's you know, there is something appealing. I'll throw this out there of being, and depending on our upbringings, like you said, based on your upbringing, you're going to have different insecurities, different wounds.
Mhm.
And those are the ones that are going to get you, that are going to make you vulnerable. It's also why we need community, because we are vulnerable and we need others to help us through that vulnerability.
Yeah.
But what I realized about myself is, you know, for me, not feeling wanted, and all of a sudden there's this person across the country who's pursuing me, right? That feels really good.
Yeah.
And so, um, you know, it's just an interesting dynamic that we don't necessarily know what might compel us.
Yeah,
It is,
especially in
yeah,
this culture, right? It's kind of strange to even make BFFs with another man. It's I have a confession to make. I downloaded an app because I didn't have a good like downtown Atlanta like bro base,
yeah,
and I was like, there must be a way to shortcut this. So I
yeah,
downloaded some app. I think it's called like Bros or something,
yeah.
and like 90% of them were gay dudes.
They were just, it was a hookup thing.
I was like, man, I can't win over here. It's
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting you say that, because I had a client, a potential. I don't think they ended up becoming a client, but it was a potential client, and his whole business model was it was a phone line to just talk to someone.
what?
So you're feeling lonely, you need a friend, you call this number and you have a friend, and you just talk and you pay per minute or whatever. So I thought that was, you know, you reminded me of that when you're with your comment, just because people are lonely.
Yeah.
They don't have that friend. They need a mentor, right? They're struggling, they're floundering. And, you know, that's appealing to them. And I think there's a lot of problems with that particular business model in terms of actually solving the root problem. But you can see, I mean, just how it can fill that void that someone might be feeling.
Yeah. So we've covered complacency and how we could all fall into this downward spiral of falling into the wrong group. And I would even argue, if you're, like you said, have these insecurities, specific ones growing up, you're either going to decide to go a very strong way this way or a very strong way that way. In my experience, people with trauma don't really stay in the middle that much. It's kind of, I've experienced this. I don't want to be in the middle, just a yes or no on this. So something to be mindful of, trying to work through that. And so as we move into atrophy, kind of living in that lifestyle, I'm sure we all seen that, what is it, Malcolm X movie? What was it called again? American History X?
Oh, okay.
That atrophy of him living that lifestyle, it took him a while to get out of it after jail and after love, and to a large extent, unbiased, unconditional love, which I was it was awesome. Awesome movie. But I wanted to draw an analogy here of the rubber band. I'm going to throw this into the book I have coming out too. But the rubber band is basically, imagine you're a rubber band and you're being pulled apart bigger and bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, you have to decide, are you going to keep letting people pull you out bigger and bigger? Or even yourself, you're pulling yourself out, you're drawing yourself out, stressing yourself out, pleasing people, or working 80 hours a week, whatever it may be. It could be either you, external, or internal factors. But there will come a point in time where if it's big enough, and depending on that, where it snaps is where you're going to pick up the pieces from. And that's kind of where the atrophy lands. So the longer duration of time you don't address this thing, the more pieces you got to pick up. And there's nothing wrong with picking up the pieces. There's grace for that. But you have to be mindful of whatever you're sitting in your life. The longer you let it just pull out, and snap, the more when you come back to recovery, picking up the pieces, you got to put that rubber band back together. And it's going to take time. You got to make sure it's extra clean, on the edges of where it snapped. You got to be mindful of how you even glue it back together, that sort of thing. So what's your thoughts on the atrophy part to this, Jason?
Yeah, so I think one of what you're describing is sort of this this idea that we become overwhelmed by outside influences, and those grow. So as we live our life, we have more and more competing interests on our life, right? And if you're married, you have kids, you have a job, you have a community, church, whatever, those grow and grow and grow, and they can grow disproportionately. It could be your work could be the biggest stressor of them, or it could be your marriage or something else. But essentially, you're at capacity, and then everything's pulling you in a direction. And so now all of a sudden, you're gonna break, right? You're at this point. And so I think the atrophy is actually a failure to identify and enforce boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so those boundaries keep getting pushed and pushed and pushed until you as a person snap. And so that's the idea with boundaries, is that you prevent that from happening, because all of us will snap, all of us will break if we don't enforce boundaries. And so the way boundaries, the reason we are complacent with boundaries is a couple of reasons. One is, and this was something I experienced with that toxic mentor, I was the type of person who avoided the conflict. And so when I screwed up, I took responsibility for my part and for his part. I overtook responsibility. And so the way that I kind of mentally think of that is, I'm carrying 3 boxes and I drop them, and now he's upset. And so I say, oh, I'll pick them back up and I'll carry 3 more, right? So now I'm escalating this effort. And if I couldn't carry 3 boxes, why do I think I'm going to carry 6? So I'm going to drop the 6, and it's just going to keep getting worse. So there's a conflict aversion that I dealt with, and for me, that ended up being more of like a passive aggressive type of outlet. Like I couldn't deal with the conflicts, so it ended up coming out in other pockets of life. And so so the conflict aversion, and then the if it's not necessarily if it's let's say it's just a normal relationship where not anything toxic, you want to make them happy, you want to please them, but sometimes it's just unsustainable. And so I remember I had an employee who worked with me, and I noticed she was just working way too many hours. And so I sat down and said, all right, you really need to cut off your work and contain this instead of doing all this extra time and all these different weird times of the day and night. And she's like, oh, yeah, she kind of got into that same place. And so when we were talking, we're in a alignment. So it worked out real well for her to kind of take that step back and do that.
Yeah.
And so
It helped
as a
that you fired her
leader,
too, right?
what?
It helped that you fired her too.
No, she stayed on board. But in some cases that could lead to something like that if it was not received well.
Mhm.
But if someone was like a workaholic and they just couldn't, they were neglecting their family or
Yeah.
something, that could cause a problem. But the idea there is, as a leader, we need to help other people enforce their own boundaries if they are struggling to, because we don't always have the capacity maturity wise to do that. And so sometimes we have to be kind of lend our whatever we're gifted in, or whatever we've in an area we've kind of developed or matured. So if I'm good at enforcing boundaries, I might have to lean on that person to help me enforce my boundaries, because I'm not good at it, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of times the reason we're not doing it is because there's something we're afraid of, or something we're scared about, or something about us that we don't want to look at in the mirror. So
Yeah,
kind of like,
for example, somebody working for me like that, to connect the dots to that business venture, like somebody working for me being unprofessional, and every time I address it, there's like resistance, there's tension. So at some point, there's so much tension or resistance that you're like, this is inefficient use of my time, you know? So at some point, it becomes a boundary of like, am I just going to keep letting this happen, be lukewarm about it and how I run my business, or just let them go and move on with my life?
yeah. And sometimes these situations don't give us an easy out. We've got to make the hard decision, and usually that's how we learn to grow in ways that, in some ways, we have to learn that when the rubber band snaps, the world doesn't end. Like our
Yeah.
world might end, right? But then we realize things keep moving, and that can be that can be reassuring, because it's like, oh, I guess we might think, well, the world doesn't revolve around me. Um, Although to some degree we might like that, but then it's overwhelming. So then it's like a double-edged sword. But once we realize that, you know, we can sort of fail and flounder, and maybe that kind of gets back to the original point, which is when that rubber band snaps, what's the life we've built before that, and what have we invested in? Who's been invested in us, and how have those investments played out? So I'll give you an example. In 2013, 14, when I shut down my company, when that reality hit home, it was very emotional, and felt like I got hit by a emotional semi truck, and I just dealt with a lot of anxiety and depression and whatnot. But I had a lot of great community around me. I had a lot of friends and people. And I had another friend who I met with a couple years after that, who had kind of gone through a similar thing, but he didn't have any community. He was kind of on his own. And so his experience was very different than mine, in terms of being caught, versus being isolated when that happens. And so, those our upbringing and the life we live make a difference when that tragedy strikes.
Yeah. What you just said made me think of, it's so easy to actually drown myself in, oh my gosh, it's the end of the world, like when the rubber band snaps.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually had one of those moments years ago where at like just about all my properties, everything went wrong. Like giant repairs all at once, and tenants vacating all at once. And so there's this massive, gigantic gap of funds. I was overdrafting my accountants and stuff like that. So it all worked out. But of course, in the midst of that, I was like, God, why are you allowing this to happen? This is the worst thing that ever happened to me. And it made me blind to all the blessings I already had. Like this literally happened to me when I was 18, man. I didn't pay a few bills. There was some bills that got racked up, and I got debt, which of course affected my credit for 7 years. But I still was able to collect like 3 to 4 rental properties in that 7 years. So me thinking that this kind of windfall or tripping of my life is gonna brutalize my credit and therefore brutalize my life is kind of like me thinking that my credit is a god and it can't just be used for when I need it, versus my life depends on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that we could also fall into that atrophy and that aspect too of making different gods.
Yeah. And whatever is most important to us will rise to the top. And that's where our relationship with God actually can help us, is because I can go, well, I can borrow God's authority or borrow his guidelines to say, okay, this isn't right. This is something I can push back on, that I might not feel comfortable doing myself. But we tend to make other things idols, and so those might be approval of this person, or it might be performance on a particular at work or whatever it might be, and so that drives our behavior. Whatever our idol is what drives our behavior. And sometimes I mean, we all have idols in different areas of life. It's just a matter of where are they.
Yeah. And can we even identify them, or do we even have the courage to identify them?
Yeah.
I also know folks that just don't want to do that either. And
Yeah.
I've even been guilty of that myself. I'm not going to parade
Yeah.
myself as the best guy. But to jump right in back into complacency atrophy, I wanted to jump through this story before we go into guilt, because these parties didn't feel guilt in the atrocities they committed as Nazis. Could you describe the scenario you did for our group, where the two
Well,
Nazis made sense of killing a mother and a son?
yeah. So I'll say there's a book called Ordinary Men. I don't think I have it here, but it talks about they interviewed these Nazis. They were recruited. They were Polish soldiers, and it tells the story. The whole book is about how they went from just being normal men in a community to being killers, Jew killers,
You said they
hunting
were
them down.
Polish. They were actually not even
It was
German.
the I believe so. Yeah, Polish
Okay.
battalion. Um, if I remember right.
Okay.
So anyway, um, let's see. Ordinary Men. Let me pull up the picture here of the cover so I can get the full name. Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and the Final Solution. Oh, it was the Final Solution in Poland. And the book just goes through this process of how how they made these men into Nazis, Jew killers, and so particularly it was the Polish Jews that were killed. And there's a particular passage that describes the justification where essentially one of the soldiers would shoot the mother, and they would have a child, and then the other soldier would justify in his mind that, well, without a mom, that child can't live. So I'm actually loving this child by shooting him because they can't live without their mom. And so they found a way to justify it. And in another book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in Gulag Archipelago, he talks about how ideology is how we can justify evil acts and be completely okay with them. So we can feel good about doing evil things because we have this purpose and ideology that justifies it. I think of as an example, like in the Bible, would be the Apostle Paul. Before he became the Apostle Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, and he was persecuting Jews. Or sorry, he was persecuting Christians. He was a Jewish religious leader, and he was persecuting, jailing, killing Christians for their beliefs in Christ, the resurrection of Christ. And so Paul, Saul at the time, he thought he was doing God's work, thought he was doing what God had him, and he was caught up in this religious extremism ideology, and he was doing what he thought he was supposed to be doing. And then he met Jesus on the road and realized that the God he was serving was not the real God, and that the real God was the one he was actually attacking, persecuting. And so he flips completely 180, goes from killing Christians to becoming a Christian in this seemingly unexplainable turn of events, and ends up being this just major figure in Christian history to spread the good news across the world, and writing half of the New Testament, which is part of our Bible now. So that's an example of that, and there are others too. I mean, just look at any event, any tragedy, and then look at the explanations of the people who instigated that tragedy. You'll often find an explanation, justification for why what they did was a good thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would add to that too. There's something simpler than ideology that can cause atrocities too, which is just your friends, your environment. There was this show I was watching with Stacy the other day. I'm not even going to say the name because it was quite disturbing, even for adults or children. But basically, in one of the scenes, they took inadvertently taken like mushrooms in their meal, their soup. And so this entire group of, I guess they're late teens, they started acting weird. Of course, you're under drugs, so you're going to act weird. But they started perceiving this one male character out of the group as a deer that they needed to kill. And they ran after him in the forest and pinned him against a tree. And one of the other girls gave her a knife to go ahead and cut his neck. And she was starting to kind of get in and out of the illusion, like, oh, this is not a deer, this is actually a person, and I shouldn't be killing. So she started looking around to the other people, and the other people were, of course, egging her on. Like,
Yeah.
hey, go, we got to kill, it's a sacrifice, we're supposed to do this. And she was about to do it. And that's really what all it could take to do something atrocious, is somebody just, hey, nudging you along, like this is a normal thing. And I think
I heard a similar story about someone committing suicide in a similar way, like they were being egged on. Go ahead and do it, by these people that were just speaking frivolously, and then the lady ended up doing it. So yeah, there's certainly a pressure or a peer dynamic that we overestimate at times. So.
And that's a key part to renewing the mind daily, right?
Yeah. And that's, I think fundamentally, I said ideology, you mentioned the word idol. I would just kind of, when I think of an ideology, I think of it's an idol that has a religious surrounding, a religious message or belief that, but it's that idolization. We will do whatever we can to, if we make something our God, we're going to do whatever we can to get that God's approval, or to make that God manifest. And so that religious instinct in us is there, and so it comes out in from nasty ways.
Yeah, kind of like how people idolize my pecs,
Yeah. So they're, you better watch out.
Tens of thousands kneel before me just for my pecs.
You better watch out. They might take them from you.
That'll be awkward.
So we have guilt here. Where we go from here?
Guilt. When it came to that personal story of mine where I was living with this unprofessional behavior for months, probably even years, I'm sure it happened behind my back, so I didn't see it a good amount of time either. There came a tipping point. And a misconception I had with Christianity is that, like, I took a lot of things literally, like give your brother, 70 times 7 forgivenesses, uh, honor everybody around you, basically put your life down for your brother. But there's another verse that adds more wisdom to that, which is honoring somebody else also involves confronting them. If you're not uh, giving them a good reproach, good confrontation, which the Bible also talks about in 2 Timothy 3:16, you're kind of keeping them in a cycle of pain for themselves, because they're just going to keep on doing it, not just to me, but to other people.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
me not confronting them is just going to keep that cycle. So I lived with it for months or years. And then at one point I snapped. And I even on that day, I was hard because there was ramifications. There was other people that would be affected by this,
Mhm.
probably dozens of people. But it was ultimately the right decision over the long term for all parties involved. So I had that guilt, which allowed me to get to the next step. Before we jump in there, Jason, what's your thoughts on guilt?
Well, one thing that came to mind when you said that was this passage from the My Utmost for His Highest, Oswald Chambers. He's talking about Abraham and God in Genesis 22:2. He says, "Take now your son and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I tell you." So he's giving some commentary, and about halfway through the commentary, he says the following line: "The great lesson to be learned from Abraham's faith in God is that he was prepared to do anything for God. He was there to obey God, no matter what contrary belief of his might be violated by his obedience. Abraham was not devoted to his own convictions, or else he would have slain Isaac and said that the voice of the angel was actually the voice of the devil. That is the attitude of the fanatic." And so the idea here is that you're connected to God, not your beliefs about God, right? And our beliefs and our convictions can actually be wrong and misdirected and manipulated. And so and when we are committed to our beliefs and convictions, it can actually lead us to do evil things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one thing that came to mind. I think the second thing that came to mind, more specifically to the guilt side of it, is when I first moved to Atlanta, I worked doing IT support. I would go into people's houses and fix their computers, and did it for residential and business. So it was a combination. Well, I often would work on computers that the reason there were problems on the computer is because of they were on the internet, places they shouldn't have been, pornography and whatnot. And so I knew this wasn't right, but I didn't know how I was supposed to handle this. So I asked my boss, "How am I supposed to handle this?" And he said, "Well, just you're not there to hold them accountable. It's not your place to do that. You just need to clean it up and move on." And I just felt like something about that didn't seem right. Because sometimes it would be, a parent, I'd be fine looking at the kid's computer, or a husband, and a husband would hire me to clean his computer, or his wife would hire me to fix the computer, but she doesn't know what's going on. And so it was kind of messy. I felt like something was wrong, but I was looking at pornography myself. So I felt guilty, like, well, how can I do anything? Because I'm doing the very same thing.
Yeah.
But I feel like there should be something healthy about reconciling these situations. And I didn't know how to do that. But the guilt kind of trapped me because I had my own problem with the same issue. And so what it did is it allowed everyone to continue in their sin, and nobody was liberated. We were all just
Right.
enslaved, and we just did it together.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the guilt side of it that comes to mind.
Yeah. That was so powerful, that especially at the beginning where you said that God really wants just a connection to us, and everything becomes easier from there.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
Many people have misinterpreted the word for self-gain.
Yeah. And that's the first line in the devotion. It says, "A person's character determines how he interprets God's will."
Yeah.
And so that implies if you have bad character, you will interpret God's will in wrong ways. And that goes to, Saul doing things he thought was God's will, but he was actually doing the will of Satan.
Yeah. I think this is a good opportunity to say why we follow God, even though it's kind of detour from the topic. But basically, I think we've both come to the conclusion that we've tried our own ways, and our own ways always lead to, let me just go hit myself on the wall here. Let me go frustrate myself again. Whereas as we get closer to God and we understand, other people look at as limitations on their free will, but for us, it's like, this is clearly a key way to live so that we're not continuing to run into walls. And so we're grateful to God for that. And also to add to that other people may not understand is we have no place to judge what God says to do, wants to do, has done in the past in the Bible or outside the Bible. It's not our place, because our place is just to, follow our relationship with him. And that'll lead us to whatever has to be done with our lives, using our talents to our best abilities, and being able to hear him better. For me personally, I see him interact with me, particularly in numbers. Like when numbers appear, that there's only one way that could have happened. It's like, 1 in a trillion chance that that number could have appeared at that paper at that certain time. So it kind of reminds me of, hey, I'm right next to you right now, and let's keep on moving forward in this. Well, what's your thoughts on that before we move on to escape, Jason?
Well, I guess we all wager our lives on something. We all have a fundamental religious belief. You don't have, if you are non-religious, you're essentially making a religious belief about non-religious. And when I mean religious belief, I mean you're making a fundamental belief. You're making a certain claim. You're accepting a certain belief that has no that has no way to be proven, right? You have to make a stake in the ground. And this is what I believe about the world, and there's no way to prove this or that. And so we wager our lives on these different ways of life, whether it's Christianity or it could be some other religion or lack of religion, but we're wagering our life on what we believe to be true. And so Christianity, there's a lot of reasons why we believe it's true, but ultimately there is a leap of faith, no matter how small you can shrink that gap. And so for me, growing up in a loving Christian community certainly gave me an advantage in experiencing that truth and living that out in my own life. And then after moving from Arizona to Atlanta, seeing that decay, kind of the atrophy, and having a contrast between the way of life that I had growing up in that loving community and then the way of life that was slowly fading away, and getting to that point, like you said, of, oh, right, God, my way is not working. Show me yours. And then him showing up and experiencing God show up. And so it's experiencing him showing up that personally cements my beliefs and cements my trust in him. And that continues as I walk with God, then I experience more of God. And so it becomes more and more the way of, but you can't really know. I mean, you can watch someone else, but to personally go through that experience requires like going through it. Like you can't learn to swim until you jump in and start swimming. And so, those are a few kind of thoughts that just come to mind about the walk of faith and what that means and where that leads, and how it's unfolded, and the experience of it, and how that's something that we have to wrestle with and to seek to understand. So
Awesome, man. Always dropping gems. Never told y'all, but I decided Jason has to be on here monthly because always, always such stimulating conversation he and I have. I wanted to let y'all into, what he and I do just about weekly. Um, Ever since we moved closer together, it's been more regular. But there's no other brother that I could talk so closely and intimately with about very serious subjects and have it in a very godly way. So thanks for committing to that, Jason. I'm going to
Yeah,
hold
you're
you to
welcome.
that contractually. So let's wrap up with the escape part. Uh, so for me, I ended up letting that person go. It was very painful, a lot of guilt around it. I even had withdrawal symptoms towards the end of like, oh,
Yeah.
should I really have done that? Maybe I need to go back. Control Z, undo, undo. But I let the feelings flow through. Uh, it ended up taking a while to recover from that decision, but it was fantastic for me, and
Yeah.
I'm really glad about where I am now. It,
Yeah.
it's kind of one of those moments where you don't know that God orchestrated it because you're so upset, but
Yeah.
it was meant for your good ultimately.
Yeah.
What about for you, Escape on?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's two types of escape. There's unintentional abandonment, where you leave the situation just to get away, right? Versus intentionally abandoning the situation, like ending it. Um, and so I think it's important that we don't unintentionally abandon things that you could have just sort of slowly broken that relationship. And just disappeared, ghosted him, or and vice versa, and never had resolution. But I think it is the more that we can, the less we can do that, and the more we can actually be more specific about, hey, this isn't working. Let's talk about resolving this. The problem with that is it does create a lot of conflict. When we end things, a lot of stuff seems to come out of us, like when you're about to die, your life flashes before your eyes, kind of thing. So
Mhm.
when you end a relationship or you end a partnership, there's kind of a similar phenomenon where, okay, all of your grievances that neither of you dealt with are now all coming out at the end because they didn't come out earlier when they should have.
Yeah.
And so there's a dynamic there. But if you intentionally abandon, if you intentionally end it, at least give a chance to kind of get all of that out of you and work it out. And so that's part of it. And then sometimes there are types of relationships where it is appropriate to end them or take a pause, a break, and some of the time we'll discover that they were probably relationships that never should have happened in the way they did. I'll give you an example. There were people in my company that I hired or brought into the company that in retrospect I realized that I wanted to help them, and I thought by hiring them I would help them, and I realized that I could have just helped them without ever hiring them, right? And so there's ways to, if we kind of get to the root of it, what is it we're trying to accomplish, and is the way we're doing it the best way to accomplish that, or are we um, I guess that would probably be the best way to put it. It's just kind of
Yeah.
understand what we're trying to accomplish and make sure that this is
Are
the
you
right
being a
outlet.
crutch, perhaps?
Yeah,
Instead?
yeah, because you can hurt someone by trying to help them, and I've done a lot of that. I've hurt a lot of people by trying to help them. So
Yeah. And I can relate to that too. I have previously, for like some certain tenants, had this kind of enabling. I didn't call it enabling. I thought it was just grace of like, yo, do you understand? They grew up in these atrocious circumstances. They had their mom just until the last week yelling at them like a maniac and throwing stuff at them. Like you can't really expect them to behave like a normal person. But in reality, no, you can give them that right to act like a normal person, especially with you, and especially early on, which is, you know, unfortunately a pretty truthful thing throughout history. If you kind of let people step on you towards the beginning, it'll just
Yeah.
kind of keep on happening.
Yeah. So I will make one quick correction. When I talked about the book Ordinary Men, it was called the Reserve Police Battalion 101, and it was formed in Nazi Germany. It was out of Hamburg, Germany. So the police force was created in Germany, and then they were sent to Poland. So little clarity there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was going to be massively outraged if that was
Yeah.
inaccurate.
But if you want to read a book in as a mirror, The Ordinary Men is a book to read, because it'll showed me how I could become a Nazi without it being it's a lot easier than we think. So
dude, before we wrap up, we got to touch on Dietrich, like a guy that was actively decided as a Christian to be like, all you y'all are running away. We need to be staying here and doing everything we can. Could you talk about that guy briefly in summary, real quick?
yeah, so Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship, which I've read and is a great book. He was in Germany, and he spoke out against Hitler and the rising Nazi party as it grew in power, and exhorted the Christian church,
even within Germany,
for going along with Hitler. And he stood up, and he ended up leaving Germany. I don't know how long it was, maybe a year or so, and he just felt like, you know what, because it was just getting so bad and the war was close to starting. But anyway, he left, and he didn't feel right, and he decided to go back to Germany. And everyone said, you can't go back, they'll imprison you and kill you, and both of those things ended up happening. He was actually killed a few weeks before his prison camp was liberated by the Allies. And he actually, I don't know the details, but he was associated with a plot to overthrow Hitler, to assassinate him. But I don't know a whole lot of the details. But he was a vocal critic and a strong Christian, and he tried to reconcile those two things while being a German, and also while also trying to call the church to their relationship with Christ instead of the relationship with Hitler, and trying to navigate all of these complex evil situations that were unfolding. And so that's he's just a really inspirational story. And
and he was even evangelizing while in prison, right?
He even wrote he wrote like a book about just the cross of Christ in his final hours on earth, which was kind of ended up being his final hours on earth as well. And I think it's an unfinished book, but he kind of has some notes and stuff that was compiled later on.
Yeah.
So
what a phenomenal life of courage. That dude has balls of steel.
Yeah. So he was not going to sit around and be quiet, go quietly into the night. He was going to do what he could to make a difference.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know what kind of difference he made, but his legacy is certainly stuck around. So
I'm sure he made big differences. Like if I recall vaguely, you can tell me if I'm wrong, there were actual prison guards that would like regularly have conversations with him or ask for prayers or something like that. Is that right?
I think you're right. Yeah, I think I remember, if I remember right, when in the Cost of Discipleship, there's a little biography in the front that talks about it, and I think it might have said something about that. He was certainly been sharing with them and listening to them.
Yeah.
So.
All right. To wrap up, I wanted to share some lyrics from Aesop Rock. And this kind of speaks to the points we've all been talking about, but also talks to like the human condition. And if we want to be real with ourselves and identify with these, I personally empathize with 99% of these lyrics at one point in my life or not, or currently. So let me jump right in. I have been completely unable to maintain any semblance of any relationship on any level. I have been a jerk to the people who have actively attempted to deliver me from peril. I have been acutely undeserving of the ear that listens up and a lip that kissed me on the temple. I have been accustomed to a stubborn disposition that admits it wished its history disassembled. I have been a hypocrite in sermonizing tolerance while skimming for a ministry to pretzel. I have been unfairly resentful of those I wish that acted different when the bidding was essential. I have been a terrible communicator prone to isolation over sympathy for devils. I have been my own worst enemy since the very genesis of rebels. Man, I got goosebumps throughout that. That is every valley of my life I could relate to at least one of those.
Yeah.
There was something that went astray that I could have kept a closer eye on, and I could have taken more responsibility over if I had the courage to.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of opportunities, missed opportunities where we could have intervened. And those are the harder ones, right? It's easy to go, well, it's easy to identify the opportunities of responsibility that we intentionally chose not to, or
to blame others.
With that what?
Or to blame others about.
Yeah. But to see an opportunity where I could have intervened, and not to, to recognize that. I mean, I think it goes back to one, avoiding conflict is one reason we don't. But the second one is we avoid regret. I don't want to accept that I was potentially responsible in that situation, because then I have to deal with regret. And to deal with regret means I have to feel that regret. And the regret is good if it changes our behavior for the positive, right? Then it's a good thing. And we want to regret things that we did so that we become a better person. If we never regret, we never change. And so that's worse. But we do want to avoid conflict, and we do want to avoid regret. And I think we got to embrace them both.
Amen to that, brother. All right. That wraps up another edition of From Pain to Gain. Look forward to seeing you next time, Jason, with your curly hair and your forest land beard.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.